What do you do with a civilization that refuses to stay dead? For 5,000 years, the great powers of the world marched toward the same destination, a vast, unforgiving plateau we now call Iran. They came with arrogance, with armies that had already crushed empires and rewritten maps, every single one of them believing that this time, the story would end differently. But they didn't realize they weren't just invading a territory, they were stepping into a cultural digestive system designed to consume them. Long before the first crown was forged, the plateau was a brutal crucible of survival. Imagine a land of jagged mountains and endless deserts where the first tribes, the Elamites, fought a desperate war against the elements and the rising shadow of Mesopotamia. They built cities like Susa, crafting a sophisticated world that challenged the very dawn of history. But the true escalation began with a whisper from the steppes. New people arrived not as a sudden wave of fire, but as a slow, creeping migration of Indo-Iranians who called themselves Aryans, the noble ones. They didn't just bring horses and chariots, they brought a psychological weapon that would change the human mind forever. Among these tribes, a prophet named Zoroaster looked into the heart of the chaos and saw a cosmic war. He declared that the universe was not random, but a battlefield between eternal light and absolute darkness. Suddenly, existence had a terrifying, high-stakes meaning. To be Iranian was no longer just a matter of birth, it was a choice to stand against the lie. This was the birth of an identity so rigid it could not be crushed, yet so fluid it could survive the coming storms. As the Medes and Persians began to coalesce, the tribal skirmishes escalated into an unstoppable hunger for unity. They were no longer just survivors, they were architects of a coming storm. But just as the first great king, Cyrus, began to turn his gaze toward the horizon, a darker realization set in. The world was watching, and the neighbors to the west were not just afraid, they were preparing to strike first, threatening to extinguish the Iranian spark before it could ever become a flame. The stage was set for a collision that would either birth the world's first superpower or leave the noble tribes as nothing more than a footnote in a conqueror's diary. The spark did not just flicker, it exploded into a conflagration that redefined the limits of human ambition. Cyrus the Great did not merely conquer, he revolutionized the very chemistry of power. As he descended from the highlands, the ancient world trembled. Babylon, the seemingly impregnable jewel of Mesopotamia, watched in horror as its walls thick enough for 4-horse chariots to pass proved useless against a man who fought with both steel and mercy. When Cyrus walked through the Ishtar Gate, the world held its breath for a slaughter that never came. Instead, he shattered the chains of the exiled, including the Jewish people, and declared a decree of religious freedom that was unheard of in an age of blood and ash. This was the birth of the Achaemenid Empire, the first true superpower, a gargantuan organism that began to stretch its limbs from the edges of India to the sun-drenched shores of the Mediterranean, but the escalation of scale brought a terrifying fragility. By the time Darius the Great seized the throne, the empire was a ticking time bomb of ethnic revolts and impossible distances. To prevent a total collapse, Darius engineered the world's first global nervous system. He carved the royal road across thousands of miles of wilderness, ensuring that his eyes and ears, a network of elite spies, could report a whisper of treason in days rather than months. He standardized currency and laws, forcing 100 different nations to speak the language of Persian order. The stakes had never been higher, nearly half the human population now lived under a single banner. It was a golden age of marble palaces and hanging gardens, but the weight of the crown was becoming unbearable. In the west, a tiny, fractured group of city-states, the Greeks, began to stir. What started as a minor colonial rebellion in Ionia quickly spiraled into a catastrophic clash of civilizations. Darius sent his armadas to crush the upstarts at Marathon, only to face a humiliating repulse that sent shockwaves through the imperial heartland. The great king died with the taste of failure in his mouth, leaving his son Xerxes to launch a vengeful invasion that would see the seas choked with ships and the mountains leveled for a march of millions. Yet, as the Persian fire prepared to swallow Europe whole, a shadow was growing in the north. A young Macedonian prince was watching, learning, and waiting for the moment when the world's greatest empire would take its final, fatal breath. We appreciate you for watching our channel, and we are very sure you're enjoying this video. Kindly make sure to like, share and subscribe, and make sure to comment the country you're watching our video from. These helps us improve more in our next video, and these makes us know that this video is a detailed and value-packed video. The shadow in the north did not just grow, it lunged. Alexander of Macedon crossed the Hellespont like a thunderbolt, carrying a grudge that had fermented for generations. The Achaemenid Empire, a colossus that had stood for 2 centuries, suddenly found its rigid order exploited by the chaotic genius of a man who refused to follow the rules of war. At Granicus and Issus, the Persian lines once thought to be an unbreakable wall of human iron began to splinter under the frantic pressure of the Macedonian phalanx. High stakes turned into a desperate struggle for survival as Darius III watched his vast armies dissolve into the dust. The climax of this tragedy struck at Gaugamela, where the air was thick with the scent of blood and the screams of dying elephants. When the dust settled, the King of Kings was a fugitive in his own land, and the gates of the world were kicked wide open. Alexander entered the ceremonial heart of the empire, Persepolis, not just as a victor, but as a whirlwind of destruction. In a single night of drunken fury and calculated revenge, the most magnificent palace on earth was surrendered to the flames. Columns that had stood as the axis of the world cracked and groaned, crashing into the ash of a dead era. To any observer, this was the end. The Iranian soul was being cremated. But then, the first great mystery of this land occurred. As Alexander stood amidst the ruins, the culture he had tried to burn began to seep into his blood. He didn't just rule Persia, he began to become it. He donned the robes of the conquered, demanded the rituals of the Persian court, and forced his generals to marry Persian brides. The conqueror was being consumed by the very ghost he had summoned, but this fusion was a fragile dream. When Alexander died in a feverish haze at 32, his empire was torn apart by his own generals like a carcass among wolves. The Greek Seleucids tried to Hellenize the plateau, building marble cities and imposing their tongue, convinced the Persian spirit was finally extinct. They were wrong. From the eastern steppes, a new brotherhood of warriors was rising: the Parthians. They were masters of the horse and the bow, ghosts who could strike and vanish before a sword could be drawn. As they swept westward to reclaim their heritage, they collided with a new, terrifying wall of iron from the Mediterranean, the Roman legions. The world was about to witness a war that would last 700 years, but as the first Roman eagle touched the Mesopotamian sun, the Parthians prepared a trap that would leave the mightiest generals of Rome begging for a death they could not find. The Roman eagle did not just land, it was lured into a slaughterhouse. Crassus, the richest man in Rome, marched into the sun-scorched plains of Carrhae, blinded by the glitter of Persian gold. He expected a traditional battle of shields, but instead, he met a nightmare. The Parthians did not charge, they danced. Their horse archers circled the exhausted legions, raining down a relentless, whistling storm of arrows that pierced through Roman armor like paper. When the Romans tried to close the gap, the Parthians performed their legendary shot, turning in their saddles to fire with deadly precision while retreating. By the time the sun set, the myth of Roman invincibility lay bleeding in the dirt. Crassus was executed, and legend says molten gold was poured down his throat, a visceral warning that the East was no longer a frontier to be tamed, but a predator to be feared. But as the Parthians held the line, a deeper, more aggressive fire was stoked in the heart of Fars. The Sassanid dynasty rose like a fever, overthrowing their Parthian cousins to reclaim the absolute glory of the Achaemenids. This was not a loose confederation of tribes, it was a centralized, iron-fisted machine of state and spirit. Under Shapur the Great, the escalation reached a terrifying peak. For the first time in history, a Roman emperor, Valerian, was captured alive in battle. The leader of the Western world was reduced to a footstool for a Persian king, a humiliation so profound it shook the foundations of the Mediterranean. The Sassanids rebuilt the world in their image, reviving the ancient fires of Zoroastrianism and turning their cities into bastions of philosophy, science, and steel. For 4 centuries, these two titans, Rome and Persia, locked into a catastrophic embrace, a stalemate of giants that drained the lifeblood of both civilizations. They fought until the earth was soured with salt and the treasuries were hollowed out. By the early 7th century, the Sassanids had pushed to the very gates of Constantinople, convinced that the final victory was at hand. They were so blinded by their ancient rivalry, so consumed by the bloodlust of a 1,000-year war, that they failed to hear the shifting sands to the south. A new sound was rising from the deserts of Arabia, a rhythmic, unified thundering of hooves and a cry of faith that the world had never heard. The Sassanids, exhausted and proud, turned to face this new shadow, unaware that the storm approaching wasn't coming to trade or to conquer land, it was coming to erase the soul of the empire itself. The desert was no longer silent. The Sassanid Empire, battered by decades of apocalyptic warfare with Byzantium, looked toward the southern horizon with a weary, fatalistic arrogance. They saw the Arab tribes as fragmented nomads, a minor nuisance to be swept away by the weight of imperial steel. But the force emerging from the sands was not a mere raiding party, it was a tidal wave fueled by the explosive birth of Islam. United under a single, uncompromising message, the Arab armies struck with a speed that defied the logic of the ancient world. At the Battle of Qadisiyah, the golden standard of the Sassanids, the jewel-encrusted Dirafsh Kaviani, fluttered in the dust. The ironclad Persian elephants, once the terrors of the battlefield, turned in a blind panic as the light cavalry of the caliphate cut through the imperial ranks like a hot blade through silk. The fall was catastrophic. Ctesiphon, the magnificent capital with its towering arch of white brick, was abandoned to the conquerors. By 651 AD, the last Sassanid king, Yazdijerd III, was murdered in a grisly betrayal at a remote mill, marking the end of the imperial line. This was the moment of absolute crisis. The ancient fires of Zoroastrianism were being extinguished as a new language, Arabic, and a new faith flooded the plateau. In Egypt, Syria, and North Africa, the old identities were being swallowed whole, vanishing into the rising Arab world. By all historical laws, Iran should have disappeared, its 5,000-year story ending in a quiet conversion to a foreign identity, but then, the invisible force of the plateau began to stir. Instead of being erased, the Iranians began to infiltrate the very brain of the new Islamic Empire. Persian bureaucrats, scholars, and viziers became the indispensable architects of the Abbasid Caliphate, shifting the capital to Baghdad, a city built on Persian soil and Persian ideas. They didn't just accept a new religion, they revolutionized it, weaving their own philosophy and administrative genius into the fabric of the faith. The Persian language refused to die, evolving into a soaring medium of poetry and science that would eventually eclipse the sword of the conqueror. Yet, just as a new, hybrid Persian identity was flourishing in a second golden age, a horrific rumor began to drift from the east. A shadow was moving across the steppes of Central Asia, a force that didn't care for administration, religion, or poetry. A force that sought only the silence of the grave. The sky over the Silk Road was turning black, and for the first time, Iran was about to face an enemy that didn't want to rule it. They wanted to salt the earth until the name, Iran, was forgotten forever. The sky did not just darken, it bruised. From the jagged edges of the Mongolian steppe, a terror was unleashed that defied human comprehension. Genghis Khan's horsemen moved with a mechanical, cold-blooded efficiency that turned the thriving cities of the Silk Road into slaughterhouses. When they reached the borders of the Khwarezmian Empire in Iran, they didn't offer terms, they offered a vortex. The escalation was swift and horrific. Nishapur, a jewel of culture and intellect, was not merely conquered, it was dismantled. Legend says that to ensure no soul escaped, the Mongols decapitated every living thing, building pyramids of human skulls that stood as monuments to a new, nihilistic era. Irrigation systems that had fed the plateau for millennia were systematically smashed, turning gardens into barren dust and libraries into fuel for campfires. This was the ultimate test of the Iranian spirit. The Arabs had brought a book, and the Greeks had brought a philosophy, but the Mongols brought only the void. As the Ilkhanate established its grip over the smoldering ruins, the population of the plateau plummeted, and the very concept of a Persian future seemed like a hallucination. Yet, even in this absolute darkness, the invisible force of the land began to exert its gravity. The Mongol Khans, men who had been raised in the saddle with the smell of blood in their nostrils, found themselves captivated by the scholars and viziers who moved among the wreckage. They began to realize that while you can conquer a world from horseback, you cannot rule it from there. Within a few generations, a miracle occurred in the shadow of the gallows. The descendants of Genghis Khan began to discard their felt tents for turquoise-tiled palaces. They converted to Islam, hired Persian poets to sing their praises, and became the most lavish patrons of the very culture they had tried to incinerate. The predator had been tamed by its prey. But history has no mercy for those who find peace too soon. Just as the land began to heal, a new monster emerged from the lineage of the great Khan, a man named Timur, or Tamerlane. He was a master of the sword who sought to outdo the cruelty of his ancestors, sweeping across Iran with a vengeance that threatened to finish the job the first Mongols started. As he marched toward the heart of the plateau, leaving a trail of fire and bone, a desperate, hidden movement began to form in the mountains, a brotherhood of mystics and warriors who realized that survival was no longer enough. To survive the next storm, Iran didn't just need to endure, it needed a new soul, and they were prepared to wash the land in blood to give it one. The mountains did not just hide the resistance, they birthed a revolution. As Tamerlane's empire fractured into a chaotic mosaic of warring tribes and petty despots, the fractured plateau bled from 1,000 wounds. But in the shadow of the forests of Jilin, a brotherhood known as the Safavids was transforming from a quiet mystical order into a fanatical military machine. Led by a teenage visionary named Ismail, these red-heads, warriors in crimson headgear swept out of the highlands with a ferocity that terrified the fragmented world. Ismail did not just want land, he wanted a spiritual monopoly. In 1501, he seized Tabriz and declared himself Shah, but it was his next move that sent a seismic shock through the heart of the Islamic world. He forcibly imposed Twelver Shia Islam as the state religion, drawing a permanent, blood-soaked line between Iran and its Sunni neighbors. This was a high-stakes gamble for the very definition of the Iranian soul. By choosing a distinct religious path, the Safavids created a cultural fortress that separated the plateau from the rising Ottoman juggernaut to the west and the Moguls to the east. The escalation was immediate and violent. The Ottomans, seeing a heretical superpower rising on their flank, unleashed their janissaries and cannons. At the Battle of Calderon, the Safavid cavalry charged directly into a wall of Ottoman gunpowder, a collision of ancient bravery and modern slaughter. Iran was pushed to the brink, its capital moved, its borders scorched, but the fire of this new identity refused to go out. Under Shah Abbas the Great, the empire surged back, turning Isfahan into a city so magnificent it was called half the world, a dizzying spectacle of turquoise domes and Silk Road wealth. Yet, as the centuries rolled on, the crown grew heavy and the silk grew frayed. The world outside was no longer moving at the speed of horses, but at the speed of steam and steel. By the 20th century, the ancient plateau found itself trapped in the great game between the British and Russian empires, its sovereignty treated like a pawn on a global chessboard. From the chaos rose Reza Shah, a man who sought to tear the veil off the past and drag the nation into the modern age by its throat. He gave the world a final, symbolic ultimatum: stop calling us Persia, call us Iran. But as the nation struggled to reconcile its ancient spirit with a cold, industrial future, a different kind of storm was gathering in the mosques and marketplaces. A shadow was falling over the throne, and the people were beginning to realize that the most dangerous conqueror of all wasn't coming from across the border, it was already sitting in the palace, and the price of the next transformation would be a fire that no king could survive. The fire did not just burn, it consumed the very concept of the monarchy. By the mid-20th century, the Pahlavi dynasty had transformed the landscape into a shimmering mirage of Western progress, but beneath the surface of oil-funded skyscrapers and French-tailored suits, a visceral hunger for the soul was rotting. The Shah, Muhammad Reza Pahlavi, sat atop a peacock throne that had become increasingly disconnected from the dust and the prayers of the street. To the world, he was the light of the Aryans, a modernizing titan holding back the tide of communism. But to his people, he was a puppet of foreign oil interests, guarded by the terrifying shadows of the Safavid secret police. The stakes escalated to a breaking point as the gap between the gleaming elite and the traditional heartland widened into a chasm that no amount of industrial steel could bridge. The explosion came in 1979, not with the clatter of a foreign cavalry, but with the rhythmic, thunderous chant of millions. A revolution of a new kind erupted, a fusion of Marxist students, bazaar merchants, and black-robed clerics, all united by a singular, burning desire to reclaim their identity from the perceived Westoxification of the state. The Shah, once the absolute master of the plateau, fled into a lonely exile, and the world watched in stunned silence as Ayatollah Khomeini descended from a plane to usher in the Islamic Republic. It was a transformation as radical as the arrival of the Arabs or the fury of the Mongols. Iran had reinvented itself once again, discarding the crown for the turban, trading the secular for the sacred, and plunging into a direct, high-stakes collision with the global order, but the price of this new soul was immediate and agonizing blood. Seeing a neighbor in chaos, Iraq launched a massive, sudden invasion, igniting an 8-year war that saw children sent into minefields and cities leveled by chemical missiles. Iran was alone, sanctioned and bleeding, yet the invisible force of the land surged back with a desperate, suicidal ferocity. They survived the war, but the transformation was far from over. Today, the plateau stands at its most dangerous crossroads yet.
Beneath the rigid surface of the religious state, a young, tech-savvy generation is stirring, their voices rising in a digital roar that the old guards cannot silence. The air is thick with a familiar tension, the same electric charge that preceded the fall of the Achaemenids and the Safavids. As the world watches the horizon for the next move, a silent question hangs over the mountains: is the next great conqueror already born, and will the 5,000-year-old phoenix survive the fire that is currently flickering in its own heart? The survival of the plateau has never been a matter of mere physical endurance, it is an intellectual siege that continues into the Silicon Age. As the 21st century dawned, the Iranian spirit found itself navigating a new kind of wilderness, not of deserts or mountains, but of fiber optics and global isolation. The escalation of the maximum pressure era turned the nation into a pressure cooker, where economic sanctions and digital firewalls attempted to do what the Mongol bows could not: sever the connection between the Iranian people and the outside world. Yet, in the quiet cafes of Tehran and the underground art galleries of Isfahan, the invisible force transitioned into a digital resistance. A generation that has never known the monarchy or the initial heat of the revolution is now rewriting the rules of engagement, using encrypted apps and decentralized networks to maintain a cultural continuity that transcends the rigid edicts of the state. This modern struggle is the latest chapter in the 5,000-year-old digestive system. Just as the Persian viziers once tamed the Mongol Khans with poetry, the modern Iranian youth are taming the harshness of their political reality with a globalized perspective. They are the heirs to a legacy that understands that regimes are temporary, but the land, and the language, is eternal. The high stakes have shifted from the battlefield to the classroom and the server room, where the battle for the soul of Iran is being fought in real time. The world looks at the headlines and sees only the friction of geopolitics, but those who understand history see the familiar pattern of a civilization that is currently in the process of outlasting its own latest iteration. The true secret of this endurance lies in the Persian concept of Iranian, an essence of being that survives regardless of the flag flying over the capital. It is a civilization that has mastered the art of winning by losing. When the borders are closed, the culture expands inward, deepening its roots in the works of Rumi, Hafez, and Ferdowsi, ensuring that even if the political structure were to crumble tomorrow, the identity would remain unshakable. As we look toward the horizon of the 2030s, the plateau remains a pivotal axis of human history. The noble land is once again preparing to shed its skin. Whether through gradual evolution or another sudden, seismic shift, the outcome is almost mathematically certain. Based on the patterns of the last 5 millennia, the invaders will be forgotten, the names of the tyrants will fade into the dust, but the civilization will remain. It is a phoenix that does not just rise from the ashes, it thrives on them. Iran is not a nation that happened to survive history, it is history's most successful survivor, a living testament to the idea that a culture built on a cosmic struggle between light and dark can never truly be extinguished. The story of the plateau is far from over, it is merely waiting for the next conqueror to realize they have already been consumed. We really appreciate you for watching all the way to the end. If you love this type of video and you are passionate about this type of video, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any upcoming and latest videos and discover more fascinating stories. Hoping to see you in the next video.